Welcome. I'm Catherine Fogarty, radio presenter and journalist. On the eve of International Women's Day, we gather in Tipperary Town Library to pay homage to our past while looking forward to the future with optimism. We meet 5 individual women whose stories are all interconnected. We hear how 2 female descendants of individuals on both sides of the War of Independence have found understanding, expression and reconciliation through poetry. Join us in celebrating the healing power of words and the influential role of women throughout history. You're very welcome to the library tonight. It's great to be surrounded by so many people. Wonderful group of women here tonight who've put together a terrific event. Delighted to be involved with them. I'm Catherine Fogarty. I work at Tip Midwest Radio, and they've asked me to help to chair the panel tonight, The Flow, but they're going to bring you all the talent and the wonderful content tonight. Briefly speaking, the format for tonight, it's marking International Women's Day. We would do it tomorrow, but there's a referendum, so it was moved forward to tonight. The theme for International Women's Day this year is inclusion, a sense of belonging, a sense of empowerment, being relevant, and delighted to see some men here tonight as well. It might be a very interesting evening that we have for you. I would like to thank a lot of people that helped to put the event together. The Tipperary Heritage Officer, Roisin O'Grady, the Tipperary Library staff, Pat Murnane, Kayla Barrett, who is here taking photographs and developing audio for tonight. I would also like to tell you about the format. Briefly, we're going to look at the relationships that have developed between a number of people here at the top table. Tricia McHale, you may know, here in Tipperary Town, involved with the Writers Group. Anna O'Leary from Dublin, Mary Alice O'Connor Long, and Annette Condon, and Catherine Wilson from Poetry as Commemoration. All of these have links that have developed over the last number of years, and we'll talk to you about that. We're going to give a brief outline of what happened at the Soloheadbeg ambush, how a local group in Tipperary Town came together to put together a booklet regarding the military graves in Tipperary Town, poetry and how that came to build the links between these ladies here. And of course, we're going to share the wonderful poems that you have. So I really do hope that you enjoy the evening, and we'll have a pleasant hour and a half. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy this evening.
I think everybody here probably in the room know the events that happened on the 21st of January 1919 at Soloheadbeg, which sparked the War of Independence. But just to reprise it, I suppose, I'm going to read an account from the Irish Times. Of course, it's very much focuses on from the authorities' side. So this event is not about making any judgments about what happened. What happened 105 years ago. And I suppose it's about the very thing that we've said this evening, peace and reconciliation through poetry, which is what the outcome has been for the people present. The Soloheadbeg murders, Mr. Justice Gibson and the crime. Good Irishmen murdered by their countrymen. At the opening of the County Tipperary Assizes at Clonmel yesterday, Mr. Justice Gibson, in the course of his address to the grand jury, referred to the murder of 2 policemen at Soloheadbeg. He said, "I turn to the general condition of the county, which I'm sorry to say on the police report presents some disquieting features. On January 21st of the present year, at about 1:15, a car with 160 pounds of gelignite from the Tipperary military barracks proceeded to Soloheadbeg County Council Quarry, 3 miles distance. The explosive was to be used by the County Council workers. The car was in charge of Flynn, the foreman and quarryman, and Godfrey, who owned the car. They were escorted by 2 officers of the police, MacDonald and O'Connell, one a man with a large family and the other a young officer of 10 years' service, and both had excellent records. When they got near their destination, they were ambushed by 6 or 7 masked men from the side. "Hand up," was cried, and they were at once shot down. From their dead bodies, carbons and equipment were taken, and the car was driven away and was found shortly afterwards. The 2 survivors, Flynn, the quarryman, and Godfrey, were only able to give a confused account of the occurrence. and Flynn has since been committed to the Clonmel Lunatic Asylum. It is an appalling crime committed upon officers peacefully performing their bounden duty. Good Irishmen cruelly assassinated by their own countrymen. The object was to get possession of the explosives for unlawful and probably treasonable purposes, and the crime was to be made safe by slaying the officers of the police. Dead men tell no tales. In a considerable part of the county, prosperous though it may be, unrest and a dangerous spirit prevails, and I am informed by the officer of the police it has been accompanied by intimidation, of which this police murder is proof and example. I regret to notice that shortly afterwards, after the murder, at Rose Green, 2 constables posted a reward for the discovery of the persons concerned in the crime. And the constables, having gone to attend Mass, found on their return that the proclamation had been removed and a notice substituted stating that persons giving information would receive the same fate as the peelers. It has been found necessary, though it may occasion inconvenience to the local community, in the interests of public safety, to proclaim a large portion of the county. Part of the area has since been removed from this imposition, but a considerable part of the county is still subject to this proclamation. We must pray. This is almost my 5th year of connection with the old Leinster circuit, practising at the bar, and as a judge of the assizes, that this sad state of affairs, evidenced by this terrible tragedy, may prove transitory, and that these political ideas which many of our countrymen entertain ought to be carried out not by physical violence and the taking of lives, but by honourable, decent men, by some approach to constitutional methods. Such ideas, instead of being forwarded, are retarded by such crimes against humanity. Now, that piece is from the Irish Times, a couple of days after the murders. Of course, here in Tipperary, it wasn't popular. The men had to go on the run, and I suppose with the public opinion wasn't exactly with them, and the clergy weren't in favour either of what happened. And a couple of months later, when Sean Hogan was freed at Knockclong, everything changed. And so the War of Independence lasted for the following 2 years or more.
Mary Alice, can I ask, how are the people in the panel here tonight connected to what happened in Solohead?
Okay. Anna O'Leary is the great-granddaughter of James MacDonald, one of the 2 policemen that I've already referred to, and the father of 7 children. Yeah. His wife, Anastasia, had already died a couple of years previously, and so the family were left orphaned, in effect. The other man was from North Cork, and he was engaged to be married. He wasn't yet married, obviously, and his body was taken back to his home.
And then the people who were involved in the ambush, they had to take shelter?
They had to take shelter, they had to go on the run. And lo and behold, Annette Condon's people at Tincurry House and Care gave them shelter. And so you have the 2 sides of the history, I suppose, really, you know.
And we'll have some more about that
Yeah.
as we go on. But in Tipperary Town in 2016, the writers group wanted to mark that decade of centenaries and had an idea about how to do something or what to do.
The local authorities had funding. They made the funding available for community groups. Now, very little, if anything, happened outside of Dublin during that period. As we all know, the rising was essentially in Dublin. There was one incident here in Tipperary, which is kind of not related, but I'll mention it anyway. Michael O'Callaghan here in the town, he got into a bit of a fracas here in the town one night, and he was a bit hot-headed and excitable, and he felt that the authorities would come after him. So he left his house in O'Brien Street. He went across the fields out to Manower, Kilross, a few miles distant. The people there, the Hennessy's, were related to him. And he stayed overnight. And the next day, funnily enough, the two RIC from Galbally turned up, and they asked the man at the Hennessy's if they had seen him, and they were kind of looking for him and whatever. And he came out of the house and he shot the two of them. They died. They're buried in Clonbeg graveyard in the Glen of Arlow. But apart from that incident, which wasn't strictly speaking related, there wasn't an event that we could commemorate. But Trish McHale was our facilitator in the writers class here in the Excel. We'd been on the go for a long time. And I suppose we were talking about the fact that there was some funding we could get, and we discussed how we might work on that. And anyway, we came up with the idea of maybe some poetry, a visit to the graveyard, St. Michael's graveyard, and Stephen O'Shea. I thought Stephen might be with us tonight, but he was coming back from London today, so I don't think he's made it. Stephen is always very interested in military history, served in the army himself. And Stephen said he would do up a little plan of the graveyard from the point of view of all, I use the term, military graves. So he worked out the plan. If you were to go into St. Michael's graveyard, most of us are familiar with it. It opened in 1914, and the graves at the very back ditch below are the military graves, the English graves, English soldiers. I would only mention one of them because I always mention him, and that is Thomas Crummy. He was a young man who was born in Athlone, and he was reared in the orphanage there. He joined the British Army, and he was killed in Thomastown, outside my gate, as a matter of fact. And the only claim to fame Thomas Crummy ever had was that he got a military funeral to St. Michael's. Yeah. And you come forward from there and you find the grave of James MacDonald, a fine Celtic cross put up by his comrades after he was killed at Soloheadbeg. And you come up another bit, and there is the Republican plot. And there's a lot of names, mainly in Irish there. But funnily enough, a lot of the people buried there died during the Civil War. They didn't die during the War of Independence. John Culnan, MP from Bancha, who served from 1900 to 1918. John would have been involved in New Tipperary here, very much in nationalist politics. He lost his seat to the Sinn Féin, P.J. Maloney, in 1918, and he died in 1920. And he's buried on the same row. And then Sean Hogan, of Sean Hogan fame, came back as an older man when he died, and he's buried there. So isn't death a great leveller? Yes. Surely.
You produced the booklet. There are very few left in existence now.
Yeah.
But it does cover what's in St. Michael's and also some graves in St. John's.
But they proved to be very popular. And people have, I've actually taken people on tours of the graveyard from time to time. You know, people would come and ask me maybe about it.
And that's what Trish did. She's produced a poem about this, and Trish is going to share that poem.
And she was very much, she was our facilitator at the class, and she was instrumental. And when we had the booklet ready, we went one evening to the graveyard in the month of May, because I remember it so well. And John Connors, a lot of you here from history profiles will know John. John has written a book about Sean Hogan. He's written a book about Dan Breen. And John and his comrades from Bursley came with us. And we had a lovely evening just having a walk around what had been produced. So Trish, with that I'll be quiet.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Alice, and everybody. You're very welcome this evening. And as Mary Alice said, it was 2016, 100 years after 1916. So you can imagine we have so many people in the writers group, and we wanted to be inclusive, looking back and trying to imagine what it was like at the time for everybody, and wondering, we often thought, I wonder what I would have done at the time. So in conjunction then with the work that was going on about St. Michael's Cemetery, I hadn't realised until Mary Alice got the funding and everything for the graveyard, for the booklet, I hadn't realised how many, say, different types of people were buried there. And ironically, I'm going to step all over the place, Anna O'Leary, whom I still call Anna MacDonald. My mother was from Glenamoy, God rest her in Mayo. Her neighbour, Jack MacDonald, just across the way, was a nephew of Constable MacDonald, who was killed. And so Anna and I are distant relatives. So we only discovered that fairly recently. So that was an additional blessing. So just to go back, I wrote the poem. It's on the back of the booklet there, and I called it Sacred Ground on a Hill. Sacred ground on a hill, hallowed by all those who lie beneath. Bird song blends with traffic sounds. Some names live on, some names have gone. Links broken, heritage gone. Some were once enemies, now, who knows? The paths each of them chose tease memory and attempts to understand. Fears and tears still blend as the spade opens new space to house those whose time has now come to dwell in this sacred place on a hill.
Can I just comment on that, because that poem struck me when I first got the booklet myself, and just a comment on, we're going to be talking about the Poetry as Commemoration as a kind of creative part of the Decade Centenaries, and it struck me looking at this that what you did here in 2016 was a hugely creative response to the start of the centenary celebrations. And so in a way you were kind of front leaders in that, using all those responses and ensuring that people all from all sorts of backgrounds affected were included. So, that's of note.
And sorry, just one last thing I forgot to mention as well. My own mother was a distant relative of James MacDonald, but he's buried in St. Michael's graveyard, and she's buried now in St. Michael's graveyard. So again,
so when I first arrived down, Mary Alice is going to explain how all this happened. But when I first arrived down and approached Mary Alice, I came down.
And that would have been 2019.
In 2019, and I came on my own kind of, I suppose, it was a personal mission. It wasn't the day of the official centenary. But it was on the actual date that he had been shot, and it came down with a few of the relatives in a quiet kind of mission. But I had a little mission of my own. I was going to dig out some information and find out some more stuff. And I'd heard about this booklet that Michael Ryan, a local historian, had produced, and everybody in every household had got a copy of this booklet. So I said, I'm going to get a copy of that booklet if I can and see what they're saying about this event. How's it being portrayed in the current climate? So I went up to the desk and I met Mary Alice. And one of the first of all, she said when I explained who I was, that I was very welcome. And that was huge, because we were in this place. I'd never been in Tipperary before. My grandmother and her siblings left Tipperary under the boycott and never returned. It's, so coming back and feeling that you weren't quite part of things, and there was this maybe slight undercurrent of hostility. Maybe we felt that. It mightn't have been projected to us to us. But so when Mary Alice said, "You're very welcome," it was a huge thing.
But the reason you came in, you were trying to find the grave.
I remember in 2019, the official commemoration, first of all, happened in Soloheadbeg, and there was a conference, a day conference in Ballacastine first, and then there was mass, and the parish had obviously important speakers. Dr. Manser spoke, Josepha Madigan spoke on behalf of the government. It was the coldest day known to man. It was freezing outside in Solohead. On the Monday, as I recall, in waltzes Anna and a couple of more people, and I was at the desk in reception in the afternoon, and you retraced your steps, and perhaps it was the other booklet, I know the one you mean, but that Michael Ryan produced from the parish of Solohead. But anyway, the question about where she said to me, I remember you saying to me, did I know where the grave was? And I said, I do. I was there this morning. And I think Anna was so shocked, because I suppose people wouldn't go. Now, I didn't instigate going, but I got invited and I hopped to it and said, I'll go, certainly. Elaine Fitzpatrick and Des Mernan, our historian, myself, Nuala Gleeson there, and a few more of our friends went and laid a wreath. And we felt, I suppose, that it was a gesture that we would make on the day. It was the date of that happening. And I think Anna was I could understand her being intimidated when she came into the Excel, and I was quite unaware of it, you see, because there was a large portrait of the wedding of Dan Breen in the foyer. And of course, to you, that would have been difficult for you. And I think it was the day before or the day after, and a grandniece of Dan Breen's wife, Bridget Malone, arrived in and said to me, she was delighted. She said, will you take a picture of it? So two different reactions, I suppose. Yeah. But I think, Anna, you seem to be... And then Anna went away, and that was it. And I retired from the Excel, and 5 years passed.
But you had said, you related that to me.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you said, you're just after missing a relative of yours. And I was saying, what relative? I mean, there's a relative of yours, her daughter runs the cafe here, the French Quarter. And I'm going, what relative do I have down there? And so that was one of the first, I suppose, weird and wonderful coincidences that have happened, magic stories that have happened about me coming to Tipperary. And then when Mary Alice said that a small group had gone up to the grave of my great-grandfather that morning and laid a wreath at the exact time that he had been shot, I was so moved by that, and I was in awe because I wasn't even aware of the time he was shot. The local historians had taken that on board. So that moved me, and that stayed with me, that.
Was that a big swing between perhaps your feelings about Tipperary prior to that? Your family were scattered.
I suppose it was embedded there, so it was something that I didn't dwell on at the time, but it was a notion that I took on board. And then what happened really was then that COVID intervened, and anything that it would have been, any kind of follow-up wasn't possible. And then Mary Alice had retired. But then I did, during COVID, I was one of those really annoying people that actually liked doing Zoom, and I did all sorts of classes, and one of them was a writing class. Now, my background, I'm not an historian, but my background is in social work, and I don't have a background in creative writing, but I went back to that as a retiree and during COVID, and I did a writing course. And then randomly, after the next one or two pieces of writing I produced, I came across poetry as commemoration, and it was then that I went to look at this
and
issue.
That's another aspect of tonight. We wanted to talk about poetry as commemoration. It was something that the state decided to do, and we have with us tonight the creative director of Poetry as Commemoration. And this was something that was set up. It had 3 parts to it, and I'm just going to chat while the ladies switch a microphone because we're making a podcast. of this to record the event for posterity. This is Catherine Wilson, and Catherine is the creative director of this, and she's just going to outline to us what poetry as commemoration involved. And thank you for coming down to see us tonight from Dublin. Thank you.
No problem. I'm delighted to be here, not least because my grandmother is from Golden originally, and she had her own stories of living next to the RIC barracks and getting tip-offs about imminent attacks and being secreted away on boats underneath the bridge. So I have my own connections to the period down here as well. So I'm really delighted to be here, and also to again hear the wonderful story of Anna and Annette. Poetry as Commemoration is a project that is run out of UCD Library. So we got funding in 2021 to start this project across 2022 and 2023. And the idea really came from working with archives and special collections. So these materials that the public have access to, but generally don't know that they have access to. And we knew as well that there were so many local repositories, such as Tipperary Local Studies here, that Mary Guinan Darmody does a great job of leading, and that people could use these materials in a different way, that you didn't have to be a historian with lots of background knowledge to come in and use these materials, that you could use them in a creative way as well. So what we wanted to do was to connect, I suppose, poetry and those archival materials in a way to, I suppose, look at this challenging period of history in a more nuanced way. And, you know, the Civil War in particular, there's a lot of silence around it, or there has historically been silence around it. Poetry is a really great genre to kind of speak to those silences. Archives also, you know, some material is preserved, but also there's a lot that's not. So there's lots of gaps, and I think there's a lovely gap, or there's a lovely connection between kind of poetry and the gaps in archives, and also the gaps in our history. And there's a way that we can kind of fill those gaps through the personal stories. And so what we did was we rolled out a series of workshops across the island. So it was an all-island project. So we ran 150 workshops in local schools, archives, museums, libraries, connecting people with their archives, and also people would bring their own family histories as well if they had them. But we wanted it to be really inclusive, so even if people, you know, hadn't grown up here, they could still come to their local library, look at the materials, learn about the history a little bit, and respond to it creatively. And out of those 150 workshops, we've created an archive of over 600 poems. So they are all now stored in UCD special collections. So we have manuscripts from school children and local writers from all over across the island. And internationally as well, people have sent us poems reflecting on their kind of own personal responses to the period. And it creates kind of a snapshot of how people are engaging with the decade of the centenaries in 2022 and 2023. So it as much represents the contemporary moment as it does the 1920s in Ireland as well.
So you've published a lot of these poetry on a virtual wall, and I love the phrase that you use, that poetry is a way of looking at a complex issue in a compressed space, because it can carry that meaning for people. And then you commission some poetry as well, but people can find all of that on your website?
Yeah. So we have a website called poetryascommemoration.ie, and there's a virtual poetry wall there that's kind of inspired by a physical poetry wall that we have in UCD Library, where we invite people to post their poems and add them. So you can search that resource through different themes, through locations. So if you're really interested in Tipperary, you can search Tipperary and find all the poems about Tipperary there. And it's a really wonderful resource because it gives you a snapshot of, like, you can find poems from 10-year-olds and then from 80-year-olds, and so it's really quite a diverse collection. A great success. Yes, yeah. And we also have, as you mentioned, the commissioned poems by established poets. So 10 poets were invited to go into archives, and we've created a fine press book. So it's a really beautiful production. We created 100 of those books containing the commissioned poems, and they've been presented as gifts to local libraries, to the local library services across the island as well. So you can look for that. I think it's Tipperary County Library. You can look for that as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you.
Catherine, I'm so grateful for you for coming down, and I want to present you with this book, which is called Stories from the Glen and Beyond, which We published last October, and I want to say a special word of welcome to James Hayes, Breathe Hayes, and Johnny Murphy, who are members of the committee there. This is our second book. The first one was about the War of Independence, I suppose, in the Glen and the surrounding parishes. And the second one was this one, which is really about the early days of the new state. But we invited Anna to present her poem and the story of her family. And I must say, it was very magnanimous of the committee, which are actually the Lisnagold, Memorial Committee, to be so accepting and say, we'll go for it, and we put that story in as well. And so Anna paid her first visit to the Glen of Aherlow last October, to where her great-grandfather would have served as a constable before he came to Tipperary. So I'd like to give it to you as a personal gift on behalf of the committee, please.
Now, Anna took part in one of those workshops in the Poetry's commemoration, and we're going to talk to Anna about that and what was the outcome.
Okay, well, as you heard, I started writing, and then I heard randomly on Facebook that there was the libraries were running this, and there was a thing called Poetry's Commemoration, and I said, right, that sounds like me. I'm now able to write a bit, and I have this story, this family connection. So I went along to the first workshop, and I kind of got off to a flying start, but then what I wanted to look at was I didn't want to look at the kind of facts of history. I mean, people down here know that there's debates still going on about who did this and when it happened and how it happened. And one of the, I suppose, the issues that cut the deepest in our family was the issue of the boycott. And I'd have more questions, we had more questions about that than other events, because other events could be explained by politics, what happened in Ireland at the time, the fight for freedom and all those events. But what happened in the boycott?
And Anna, that boycott is the boycott of the family.
It was a boycott of the family. So if it was something that the family were in this tailspin of this horrific shooting of their father. They were still bereaved by the death of their mother. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, following the reprisals, that there was an order that to boycott people from or anybody to do with the RIC, and that was a strategy. Now, in retrospect, and with the benefit of history and historians, we now understand what that tactic was and why it happened and all that. But for that family at the time, my granny and her brothers and sisters, they couldn't get bread, they couldn't get milk. They were ostracised, and they'd had this little plan to keep things going together because they'd been able to cope after their mother had died with the Auntie Eiley was doing Banatee. They were all kind of going to stay there and do their best. And then it all fell apart because of the boycott. And they literally had to leave town. Their home was gone. They were all separated and to the winds. And so that... They took that very personally, and they never came to terms with that. And it was very hurtful for them. And we can all understand and empathise and understand how they felt about that. And, that was a legacy in the family. So that was the issue I wanted to explore in the poem, because I was kept on thinking, would people really be that unkind? Would humanity not prevail in some kind of way? Would people kind of behind closed doors be able to show another side? Obviously, if you're told you can't serve these people, your business could be down the tubes if you did, and all those kind of reprisals could happen to you. So, but I was thinking, behind the closed doors, was there some kind of kindness shown? So I developed a kind of a theme around that, and then I struggled, I have to tell you, because I had to explore the other bits of history that I'd kind of put onto the back burner in my whole life, and it wasn't greatly discussed in our family. So I had to go back and glean bits of information and all that. And I finally, after kind of festering with all sorts of feelings, I was very taken aback by the kind of the feelings I had to explore to come out the other side and, you know, come to the conclusions that I did. So that was the writing of the poem, and it took a long time. Also, I had to be very mindful because of the issue that was involved, that I was very careful about the language that I used, that it wasn't a emotive language as such. If there's a word in there, there's a word connected to that, the words, you know, the words that are used with your words referenced by history and by speeches and things like that. And that was my writing journey. And then just when I was kind of ready to go with that, I came back down and made the connection with Mary Alice, Trish McHale and Sean Jackson, and Betty Ryan was another person who showed me a lot of kindness at the time. And I got into the poem with them and what I was doing. And I was met with kindness and interest and information and support. And with their support, I was able to do something, you know, incredible, walk in the footsteps of my grandmother in a very kind of free way in Tipperary and develop more understanding about what went on and what people felt here as well. So there was.
Did it ever seem as if there wouldn't be a poem, that a story would be the outcome?
Well, first of all, I don't think Catherine Wilson thought there was going to be a poem, because I went along and I was flying along writing all these things. And then I really did fester, and I couldn't, you know, I had to deal with trying to get over because I suppose maybe I had to get into feeling what my grandmother and those siblings felt, and the hurt they felt and the anger they felt. And I would say that, you know, there's plenty of people in the family that have just carried that on they've internalized it. And I had to unpick all that. I wouldn't have necessarily had said that I was harboring all these resentments and anger and upset, but I had to unpick that in order to get to the place I did. So that was eventually, it was months later that I think I surprised Catherine Wilson by sending her an email saying, well, here I am, 5 months after the workshop finished and I have a poem. So I'm very grateful to the response I got from Poetry's Commemoration and Catherine Wilson, and not just then, but since then, all the support they've given. And I really feel that I've grown as a person and a poet through all this as well. So.
That examining of the feelings, though, a lot of cases where something has happened, that's not done.
No. And it was difficult. I mean, I couldn't make it up, you know, because those people aren't around. But I did go back and look at what little bits of evidence there were in the family, what, you know, my counterparts in the family had heard from their grandparents, and we pieced it all together and pieced the history back together. And of course, I just felt it was important to put that poem on record and that story on record then as it became later, because there's many stories that were untold. There was a stigma around being on the wrong side. You know, he was a man, just had a particular job at the time, was doing his job. And people who went off to fight with the British Army that thought they were doing a good thing. And so there were people who were tinged with this association, and you're kind of nearly ashamed of it yourself, and you had to keep quiet. That family, my granny's family, some of those members literally had to go underground, and one changed their name, that the association was so detrimental to their well-being. And of course, they were living in turbulent times. They didn't just leave Tipperary and everything became great. They were straight into the Civil War and everything that went on. So I felt it was important to kind of tell the story and put it on record and say what I had to say without, I suppose, being factual, and put it on record without being offensive to other people, and respecting all, you know, the traditions and what has happened and how Ireland became. Yes, I will stop talking about it and read it now. So I'll stand up so everybody maybe can see me. So it's called Sentinels. As I delve into the archives of your violent death, my question is not one in the historical debate of who did what, why and when in Tipperary in 1919. Was there a kindness shown to your orphaned children? Perhaps a motherly neighbour wiped away the tears or left a still warm apple tart on the back sill at Morgasty. A seeping sadness that my teenage self, naive of history, did not ask the questions to my grandmother, Elizabeth, your daughter. The tattered remains of your family scattered, far from their town where they were boycotted by IRA order to outcast families of the RIC. In our nation's difficult revolutionary birth, yours is deemed a necessary death, commemorated, even celebrated in 2019. Yet, at your graveside, with prayers of respect, a wreath was laid by some of the local community, shining a beacon through a century-long hurt. My hope is lifted by these sentinels of kindness, conjuring up ghosts from a Tipperary past, quietly offering solace to your children left bereft. The humanity in this small, powerful act at your grave brings me to a kinder place within, where mercy and forgiveness begin to dwell.
I thought it was just a remarkable poem. The first time I got a copy of that, the ladies had met here in the Excel and I'd come over for a few moments and gone back to the office, but I didn't read it straight away. And then when I read it, I just thought it was magnificent. It's just incredible. I think you really did capture what you wanted to do there. And I hope, Catherine, it was a gem of what you wanted to achieve through Poetry as Commemoration.
Yes, absolutely. Anna's poem was a wonderful example of what we were trying to achieve with Poetry as Commemoration. Her poem revisits a historical moment that is well known by many, but it's revisited from a very particular and personal perspective. And that's really what we were hoping would emerge from Poetry as Commemoration, that people would look at these familiar historical moments and also excavate less known historical moments, those kind of individual histories, those smaller histories, and shed light on them and investigate them in a different way. Anna asks the question in her poem, was there a kindness shown to your orphaned children? And I think that really gets to one of the aims of the project as well, which was to develop kind of an empathy for different perspectives.
Annette, you've been sitting here very patiently, but you have a story to tell too about this and your relationship. Perhaps you could tell people a little bit about Marion Tobin.
Sure, yeah. So I'm from Kerr, so thank you everyone for coming. So I grew up hearing about my grandaunt Marion Tobin, and I knew that she was Tipperary's first female councillor and that her house in Tincurry had been destroyed by the Black and Tans. And my father told me the story that in defiance she pulled out the piano onto the lawn and played God Save Ireland. So I knew that much, but fast forward to 2018, I'm on my way into the supermarket in Kerr to do my shopping, and Josie O'Neill, who's below in the audience, rang me and said, we're doing a book about women in Kerr, Daughters of Duniskig. Could you write a chapter on Marion Tobin? Now, Joe was very persuasive. You don't say no to Joe. So I walked into the supermarket thinking, oh my God, what have I signed myself up for? I was very lucky because the Military Services Pension Project had just released a lot of information. And that was when I kind of discovered Marion Tobin's really important role at the start of the War of Independence. So the men who had killed your great-grandfather, they fled and they were turned down at lots of doors, had doors closed in their faces. They came over the railway tracks to care, and Marion Tobin opened her door to them. At that time, she was a widow herself and she had 3 young children, and she took a great risk really in the whole thing. So I wrote the story in the book, and Mary O'Donnell, Mary Caulfield is here. She was another one of the writers in the book, and the book was recognised as Tipperary Book of the Year. And then during COVID, Joe came up with the wonderful idea of developing a walking tour around care. Now it was in COVID during lockdown, so we all obviously had to comply. So we came up with a list of women from the book, and I think it's fair to say Marion Tobin was kind of the star. And we decided on a walking tour around care with temporary plaques. And I think during COVID, everybody was kind of bored. So it gave people a new walking tour, and I suppose something to learn about the women of care. We also did it virtually. So people who were cocooning or who were outside the 5 kilometre limit, or indeed were abroad, a lot of people living in London who couldn't come home to care said it gave them an opportunity to walk around care again, because we had little video clips and people could sort of go around on the stops like they were doing a virtual tour. So that was recognised in the National Heritages Award. We actually won an award for that. And at that stage, I suppose I got so interested in the Marion Tobin story that I have done another piece of research where I have gone even deeper into her life and kind of to try and understand what motivated this woman to get involved. So the story is going to appear in Tipperary Historical Journal next year, and Elaine is here. Elaine has seen, I managed to dig out some family photographs that I think have not been seen before. So I'm hoping that, you know, people will enjoy the read. The Tobins certainly were a very interesting family. Just to say, Marion Tobin is buried in Ballyluby, and on one side of the grave, it commemorates her husband as captain of the Irish Volunteers. And on the other side, his nephews are commemorated. Both died in World War I as World War I heroes. And I think that kind of shows the complexity of life in Ireland. You know, my father served in World War II. He, in his book, he was fighting to defeat Hitler. He was part of that story. So I think we all have, history is complex, it's nuanced. And as you said, we're not judging what happened in the past. I mean, we have no idea, you know, what they went through in the oppression. But being proud of my great-grandaunt, she's my father's aunt, so my grandaunt, doesn't preclude me from feeling compassion for Anna when, you know, she read her poem. So anyway, I went along. Again, Jo O'Neill was instrumental. She rang me and she said, Poetry as Commemoration are doing workshops in Thurles. And I know you like creative writing, I know you like history, so it combined both my passions. So I went along, and I just want to say, I suppose as a result of all the publicity about Marion Tobin that appeared in the National, whatever, I think it raised an awareness of her, you know, role as First Councillor. And I want to thank Marie Murphy, who's in the audience, Councillor Marie Murphy, former chair, because she really spearheaded the idea of having a bust commissioned to commemorate Marion Tobin in the new library in Care. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. And Marie was very instrumental in all of that. So I went along to the poetry workshops, and they, as Catherine said, they had all the archival material out there. And I wrote a poem actually about the Civil War, but this is the poem I wrote about my grandaunt. So, and just to say, I don't know if any of you know Tincurry House, it was destroyed and it was rebuilt, but it featured in its facade as sort of a tower. So inside the house there was a round room. There still is actually. I've been lucky enough to visit it thanks to the McCarthy family who lived there. So my father as a little boy was fascinated by this round room. Why would his aunt have a round room? So he asked her the question, and in the poem you'll hear what her answer was. Okay. So, the destruction of Tincurry House, in memory of my grandaunt Marion Tobin, War of Independence heroine and Tipperary's first woman councillor, whose home in Care was destroyed by British forces in May 1921. In the round room, there are no corners for the cats to piddle in. A phrase my father remembered her saying. No matter, they still came in their clattering boots to blow up her home, Tincurry House, 1 hour to take sufficient clothing and food, no furniture to be removed. Yet she pulled the piano through the French doors, onto the lawn by the tulip tree, and played God Save Ireland, her daughter Eva singing with her. God save Ireland, said the heroes. God save Ireland, said we all. The music rising to a crescendo, above the thud of pick and hatchet, above the staccato bang bang in each room, above the vinegar of metal and burning wood, strong notes drifting upwards in the spring air to join a crackling symphony of orange and blue. The dear old house and home blown to the four winds of heaven. Afterwards, she shared the food she had salvaged with the Tans, beer and sandwiches on the smoky lawn.
Marion was born in Knockgraffan in 1870. She died in 1955. She did apply for a pension in 1950. I think it was awarded in 1951. That's the time span. And of course, as you say, when the new library is built in Cahir, that bust will be installed there to remember her forever, really. But sound like a formidable woman?
I would say she must have been, because, as I said, her husband was dead. She had 3 young children. Interestingly, the destruction of Tinkerry House was actually discussed in Westminster, which is kind of, it was kind of ironic reading it, because her brother-in-law was a magistrate and a surgeon in the UK and very well connected with MPs there. So, so she had this connection. So, she sounded a very formidable woman, and certainly in the Civil War, she was against the treaty. But she sounds like a very strong-minded woman for sure.
And she had just become a widower in 1918, so
Yes.
it's in that context of that time.
And just shortly before that, my grandmother, who they were very close, had died. So she'd had 2 major bereavements, and yet she still opened her door to the men that night when so many people, turned them away, which I think was pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. And at your poem, Tinkerry House, what year did you write that?
Last year.
And then, so you've gone to a workshop in Tipperary, Anna's gone to a workshop in Dublin. Then there was a symposium in UCD in August.
There was a symposium
In
organised
Newman House,
at Newman House in Dublin at the Museum of Modern Literature. In October, was it? It was in October last year. So I just kind of randomly decided to take a day off work and travel up, because I thought it would be nice to just spend a day in Dublin, listen to poetry. And that's how I met Anna.
Yeah, and I'd been asked to go on one of the panels as a participant. There was a lot of poets there who had run the workshops and people who'd run the workshops, and it was kind of a review of the whole project. So I was asked as a participant to explain the family connection and read my poem, and I did that. And then when I did, I suppose it was a kind of pretty, it was a big event, and I was a bit nervous. And when I sat down afterwards, I thought, well, that's it. Now I'd be able to enjoy the rest of the session, listening to the other people. And then just as it was finishing up, Annette spoke up, and
I suppose I was very moved by Anna's story. I mean, I suppose that's the thing about war, however noble the cause, however justified or unjustified it is, it always brings, pain and suffering. I mean, we've seen this in Ireland. We see it now in Gaza and Israel and the Ukraine. So I suppose it was just kind of human compassion, really. I just, felt I could see, the pain still in her face. And so I just put up my hand and I said, the men who killed your great-grandfather took refuge in my grandaunt's house that night, and I'm sorry for the pain your family suffered.
And there was a gasp and silence, and it was a kind of bit of a surreal moment, because I was sitting there and actually was saying, is this really happening? That, I couldn't actually believe, and, that you had made that comment as well. So the session finished, and
You weren't close enough to speak at that stage.
We weren't. The session just finished very quickly after that, and I think people were watching us in the room to see what our reaction was. And I'm sure I don't know if I looked like I was going to cry or explode, because I was just in shock and a bit of bewilderment about what was happening. But the minute it finished, I went down to Annette and we had a big embrace and chatted together, and it had a big impact on everybody who was there. Like, it was.
I think particularly there were people from Northern Ireland there, and I think they in particular were I suppose, moved, because maybe it gives them hope that in future that, maybe some of those bridges will be crossed up there as well.
And it's that expression is good for the person making the expression, and it's good for the person that's hearing it, rather than it being left unsaid.
Yeah.
I thought about not saying it, I'll be honest, and then I thought about maybe going up afterwards and saying it privately. But I don't know, it was a spontaneous moment, really.
And I think that's the thing. I do believe in some of this. That's a story, my Tipperary story and the family story and what happened in Project Commemoration. There is this aspect of maybe women being able to step into that place of trust, of taking a bit of a risk and intuitively trusting that, it's not going to be awful. And I think we've done that. We took that risk. And you took that risk because, as you said, you could have just said afterwards, like, whatever. So you didn't just... And it had a huge impact on the people there. I think Catherine Wilson recorded it. And we were saying afterwards, like, nobody said anything to us about that. But we realised afterwards that out of respect, people just let us there to have our moment and quaff some of the free wine and exchange emails. And, we were just on a kind of bit of a high after meeting each other. And we hit it off personally as well. So we arranged... to kind of email each other, and then we did, and I got an email from Annette, and she said, "Don't laugh, I'm just writing a poem about our meeting." And I wrote back straight away, said, "I am laughing because I'm writing one as well." So we were kind of very much on the same page. And then I wrote my poem and Annette wrote hers, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear that Annette finished hers before me, and I was a bit behind. And she sent me hers, and I just wouldn't read it because I didn't want to be influenced by any other part of the event. So, and I wrote mine then. So we actually knew we were writing the poems, but we didn't collaborate on what was going into them. And when you hear them, it's unbelievable. There's totality about them, and very complementary poems that each perform a different role. So it was absolutely terrific. And then we'd had the support from Poetry's Commemoration, and Catherine Wilson had put the moment and what had happened, and this point of reconciliation through the creative process, to the special advisory group in charge of the Decade of Centenaries, about the power of this creative stream. And she'd also then written an article in the Irish Times which gave us a great a description of the actual, I suppose, the historical moment that was.
So the writing skills really did deliver an awful lot.
The writing process, and it absolutely.
Can we hear the poems?
Yeah, I think yours sets the scene.
So I call my poem Encounter in Newman House, and I don't know, Newman House is in Stephen's Green, so on the day I was kind of looking out the window and I was imagining the fighting that would have taken place there during the War of Independence and the Civil War. So, Encounter in Newman House. Despite peace, the echo still rages in our hearts and heads. Safe in the sanctuary of Newman House this autumn day, we relive the hand-to-hand fighting up and down St. Stephen's Green. Picture Irish heroes against the drunk, mad, black and tans. Listen to communiques from the forecourts, brother against brother, splashes of blood on the pavements. We are witnesses to Anna's raw pain, hurt passed down the generations. We hear of her orphaned grandmother, siblings shunned, refused a loaf of bread and pint of milk in the local shop, forced to abandon their home
split up and scatter. A scar 100 years deep runs down the M7, winds across Ireland through hills and ditches. We follow the blood 100 miles back to Sulkeodviog, Little Wood of Swallows, a few miles outside Tipperary Town. A cold January day, a lonesome road. The first shots in the War of Independence, an event we learn about at school. 2 Catholic RIC officers fall dead. The volunteers escape across fields, railway lines, seeking shelter, but are turned away. Yet Marion Tobin opens the door of her home to the Tipperary 3rd Brigade, the most wanted men in Ireland. Her drawing room at Tincurry House, much like this. Ornate fireplace, shuttered windows. I feel guilt, the need to speak up, stand and say, the men who killed your great-grandfather took shelter in my grandaunt's house that night. I'm sorry for the pain your family suffered. My voice cracks on the final words, my confession a plea for forgiveness. Our 2 stories brought us here. They collide, dovetail after a century. Ghosts watch. Silence falls from the baroque ceiling. Manna drifts along the golden curtains. It washes over the room. Anna and I embrace.
I think it should be mentioned as well that this is the first time we have read these poems anywhere, and we were keen to bring the poems back to Tipperary. And it's the first time we've read them to each other as well. We've exchanged them. So I'll read my poem, which is 2 Women Embrace. This fateful moment when history and present collide, you spoke your truth in response to mine. I'm sorry your family suffered, an apology never before uttered. The room silenced and still, watchful for our next move. Tears in the room witness us, making our own piece of history, where the poet's pen is mightier than the bullet spent. Kindred souls in poetry met, clasped and hugged, healing the fissures of years, ancient foe, now a friend. The bloodline of brave Tincurry women has been continued so well in you. What chance has brought us together? Ismisha Dukara Berbu.
I can only imagine how that scene was in Newman House for the people who were there. I think for everybody it must have made it so worthwhile to have that opportunity of expression and dialogue. Catherine?
Well, as you can imagine, Catherine, the interaction had a huge impact on the audience at Molly that day. They were there for, as you mentioned, the symposium that was one of the culminating kind of acts of the Poetry as Commemoration project. So it had been 2 years leading up to this moment, and then to have that story play out in front of the audience who were so familiar with the project and had taken part and contributed to the project, it really was quite a moment. And I think, you know, it's not surprising that the air was kind of taken out of the room and you could have heard a pin drop. It really was quite something. And it certainly was a takeaway for many of the attendees at the symposium that day.
There were so many elements to this. I've written my own thoughts on it: active reconciliation, people being aware of history, communication skills, and these opportunities for dialogue as well that the Poetry as Commemoration gave. And I think in that decade of centenaries, it was struggling at times. What was it to do? Was it to commemorate, to celebrate, to remember? What was it to do? It's 100 years later. There was very little done, I think, in the way of reconciliation in the foundation of the state. It was all buried very deep, I think.
Yes, I suppose, listen, there's no perfect formula for reconciliation. You can't necessarily prescribe a route to healing. But what you can, I think, provide, and Poetry's Commemoration has demonstrated this, is that you can provide opportunities for people to engage in supportive environments, in depoliticised kind of environments. And that's where the creative arts comes in as this link piece. I think the example that Anna and Annette's story has shown really demonstrates that that is possible, that reconciliation is possible through this kind of creative engagement.
In the context of 2024, is there something about women's perspective, vulnerability, that would be more helpful if it could have more prominence?
Well, I would say that on the wider issues, I mean, one of the things that they say the history aspect to the decade centenaries and projects like Poetry's Commemoration, opening up the archives and the military pensions records, that like women in an awful lot of ways are written out of history, and we've been able to start to, particularly those pensions, you know, pull out the information about the role of women because they were kind of suppressed, and so there are those wider issues about women written out of history and you know, and what matters. And I suppose that we can say that women have a unique contribution and role to play, and you know, that's up to us to play it.
We do have one final poem we'd like to bring to you.
I want to make a comment about this. I've kind of I've decided I wanted to just introduce this and introduce the speaker because I wanted to make a couple of comments. Really, I suppose I'll stand up just to make them. I suppose when we're looking at, you know, you've heard a bit of the history here, and we're looking at the time arc of what we dealt with. We had 2016, the military booklet and the writers group. We had the 2019 me coming down, meeting Mary Alice, 22 writing the poem, coming back down to Tipperary, 23 all the work that went around with the poem down here and with the stories from the Glen and beyond, and then this event, like 2024, coming back and doing this. And I suppose in that time arc, there's been one constant, and it is Mary Alice. And at the eve of International Women's Day, I really just want to pay tribute to all she has done and you know, that's just dealing with our little arc of a story. And I know that Mary Alice is an activist here, a historian, a filmmaker, and a writer in her own right. But in terms of just what happened, maybe it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been the person. You hadn't been the person to be there in the Excel. So I just want to pay a personal tribute to Mary Alice and to thank her. And then on the other hand, getting to our final poem of the night then, if we are to bookend this night, we've got the start of it in the graveyard with the beautiful poem, Sacred Ground, and this notion of people in the graveyard and Death the Leveller. And I just want to bring it to the end of it now to another graveyard this evening. And that is St. Fintan's graveyard in Sutton, which would be my local graveyard. And my granny, that daughter of James MacDonald, is buried there. And another person is buried there. And that other person is Sean Hogan Jr., the son of Sean Hogan, who's Sean Hogan Sr., who's buried in St. Michael's. And one of the things that happened, another weird and wonderful piece of magic that happened, was that I actually, kind of the penny dropped at me. I think I know that Hogan family. they lived 4 minutes away from my family home, and we kind of knew them. Like, I knew his son, Sean Hogan's nephew. I knew him and I knew his sister. So Sean Hogan Sr. had 3 sons. One of them was Hugh, that's Tracy Hogan's father. One of them was Sean Hogan Jr. And the other fellow, Tom, I think he went to Australia. And I did come across a poem then in John Connor's book that Sean Hogan Jr. had written a poem in a little booklet of remembrance, and he'd a little poem in there called Remembering Dad. And then I reached out to Tracy Hogan and asked Tracy, would it be okay if I use that poem here tonight? So I think it's significant that, first of all, you have the daughter of James MacDonald, who was shot, and the son of Sean Hogan, who was in that 3rd Brigade, in the same graveyard. And it's significant that the family of Sean Hogan and through Tracy Hogan has given me permission to use this poem in Tipperary tonight. So that poem is our finishing poem, and Mary Ellis is going to Remembering Dad.
And I can add another little bit to that, because this little book, Soft Shadows by My Side, which is by Sean Hogan Jr., was published and launched in Tipperary Town in the Royal Hotel in February of '98, and I was there. So was Dennis. Dennis, you were there as well, and you were Nuala. Liam O'Muraku, do you remember Traum Agus Aitrim? He did the launch. Isn't that an amazing coincidence? And when Anna told me about the poem, I said, I have the book of that. I posted it to her. I sent it to her. And I have actually, he has a lovely account of, and I was very struck by him. I remember he was a lovely, very tall, grey-haired, distinguished man. And he's written a lovely piece about Christmas on the Tipperary Hills, which Catherine and I used. I delivered the piece on the radio for our Christmas programme. So, remembering Dad, lying there, broken soldier in my arms, no more struggle, life's flickering way has decreed, trying to say the words, still not daring, lest softness would break your heart, fingers touching my hand gently, I the dreamer, you the soldier, dead your land is free.
I think with all of this is just showing the magic of words and the magic of poetry. Some people are very interested in poetry, some people wouldn't admit to be interested in poetry, but it is a magical medium. It really is.